It has already been mentioned that each of the opposites in which the ethical substance exists contains the entire substance and all the moments of its content. If then the community is that substance conscious of what it actually does, the other side has the form of immediate substance or substance that simply is. The latter is thus, on the one hand, the inner notion or general possibility of the ethical sphere in general, but on the other hand, equally contains within it the moment of self-consciousness. This moment which expresses the ethical sphere in this element of immediacy or simple being, or which is an immediate consciousness of itself, both as essence and as this particular self in an other, i.e. as a natural ethical community, this is the family. The family is the unconscious, still inner notion of the ethical order, stands opposed to its actual, self-conscious existence. As the element of the nation's actual existence, it stands opposed to the nation itself. As the immediate being of the ethical order, it stands over against that order which shapes and maintains itself by working for the universal. The Penates stand opposed to the universal spirit. We come now to paragraph 450, where Hegel is going to make the divine law much more concrete, both in what it is, i.e. as the family, and in terms of what it is opposed to and how it is opposed to it, that is the community or the human law. Hegel begins this paragraph by stressing a point that he's going to re-emphasize at several places throughout this paragraph, namely that when we're talking about the ethical substance or we're talking about spirit, however we want to frame it, it's splitting into two moments does not mean that each of the moments is, losing part of itself and holding on to another part of itself. Rather, as he says, both of these moments do in fact continue on embodying the totality or the whole of the ethical substance. He says each of the opposites, the opposed, set against each other things in which the ethical substance exists, each contains the entire substance. So both are the ethical substance. And in a certain respect, to attempt to isolate and have the ethical substance without one side would be to lose the ethical substance in a certain way. There's more that could be said about that, but I just want to pass over that as sort of a pregnant remark, something worth mulling over. Now he goes on and he also says, both sides not only contain the entire ethical substance, they contain all the moments of its content. So this doesn't mean that they're identical, but this means that they do both have what is really primary, what is really essential in each of the sides. One of those things that I put up here on the board, because I wanted to stress this, both contain self-consciousness. They do not contain it, however, in the same way. And here is where the interplay begins. So he says, if the community is that substance conscious of what it actually does, why is the community the substance conscious of what it actually does? Because it has laws, human laws, which are promulgated, or at least, are there available as zitta, as customs or ethical norms. And people can, see this stuff somewhere. They may not see it written down necessarily, but they can at least talk about it. There is a government. People understand where things fit in this. Things are above the board, as we said. They're manifest. So he says, the other side is the form of immediate substance or substance that simply is. So it sounds here like we're talking about the for itself and the in itself. And to a certain sense, that's true, except this is a in itself that is going to become progressively for itself. And this, by being for itself, is already sort of in itself. The laws become something that are just there in a pure positivity, as we see later on. So he goes on and he says, the latter, what is that? The family, right? The latter is on the one hand the inner notion or general possibility of the ethical sphere in general. but on the other hand, equally contains within it the moment of self-consciousness. Not self-consciousness as yet explicitly conscious of self, but self-consciousness in a more subterranean, unconscious manner, as we're going to see. Now he goes on and he says, here we go, the general possibility of the ethical sphere in general, right? There is something that goes on within this side that isn't being adequately dealt with on this side. So he says, the moment which expresses the ethical sphere in this element of immediacy or simple being, or which is an immediate consciousness of itself, both as essence and as this particular self in an other, that is, as a natural ethical community, this is, he says, the family. Now, we don't want to say, well, but what about, stepchildren and divorces and all. No, Hegel is talking about the family in the traditional sense, understood as a basic unit of the society, but also as a pairing off of male and female reproduction within there, probably extension back to previous generations, the sort of thing that we're talking about in traditional societies. When we talk about the breakdown of the family, we have that sort of thing in mind, right? And so what is he telling us about the family? The family, as the unconscious, still inner notion of the ethical order, stands opposed to its actual self-conscious existence. What is its actual self-conscious existence? The family as part of the community. The family as belonging to perhaps a larger family, the clan, which then has, people in charge, or the family as belonging to a particular residential area within a Greek city-state, or the family as we can go on and on and on with all sorts of interesting permutations. But insofar as it's understanding at first where it fits, it's getting that idea essentially from the society, which is telling it, okay, you are a household, you are a family, you count in this way and not in this way. Here's the things you can do, here's the things that you can't do. Now, within that, of course, within that scope, there's this whole subterranean, place where the people who actually belong in the family are living out their relations with each other. And unless the state or the larger society becomes somehow involved, they have no clue what the hell's going on in here. And that can be good or that can be bad, right? Hegel, again, is just looking at this in sort of a generality. So he says, as the element of the nation's actual existence, it stands opposed to the nation itself. As the immediate being of the ethical order, it stands over against that order, which shapes and maintains itself by working for the universal, that is the state, right? Or the nation, the community. The penates, the deities of the household, the ones to whom you would make your own private devotions, because they don't apply to everybody else. They just apply to you and those who are related to you. Those, Hegel says, stand opposed to the universal spirit. So we have an interesting disjuncture here. And the fundamental question that we're going to have to ask ourselves as we move forward through this is, does rationality, does the development of spirit and all the things that go with it that Hegel is so in favor of, do they primarily fall on the side of the state? Or does this domain of the family in some respect matter? Does it need to have its side taken up and spoken for? And the answer is, it is the second. But now we have to see how that plays out. However, although the family is immediately determined as an ethical being, it is within itself an ethical entity only so far as it is not the natural relationship of its members, or so far as their connection is an immediate connection of separate actual individuals. For the ethical principle is intrinsically universal, and this natural relationship is just as much a spiritual one, and it is only as a spiritual entity that it is ethical. We have to see what constitutes its peculiar ethical character. In the first place, because the ethical principle is intrinsically universal, the ethical connection between the members of the family is not that of feeling or the relationship of love. It seems then that the ethical principle must be placed in the relation of the individual member of the family to the whole family as the substance, so that the end and content of what he does and actually is solely the family. But the conscious end motivating the action of this whole, so far as it is directed towards that whole, is itself the individual. The acquisition and maintenance of power and wealth is in part concerned only with needs and belongs to the sphere of appetite. In part they become in their higher determination something that is only mediated. This determination does not fall within the family itself, but bears on what is truly universal, the community. It has rather a negative relation to the family and consists in expelling the individual from the family, subduing the natural aspect and separateness of his existence, and training him to be virtuous, to a life in and for the universal. The positive end peculiar to the family is the individual as such. Now, in order that this relationship be ethical, neither he who performs the action, nor he to whom the action refers, can be in an accidental relationship, as happens perhaps in rendering some assistance or service in a particular case. The content of the ethical action must be substantial or whole and universal. Therefore, it can only be related to the whole individual or to the individual qua individual. And this again must not be understood as if it were only imagined that doing him a service would promote his total happiness, whereas the service, being an immediate and actual deed, produces only a particular effect on him. Nor must we imagine that service in the form of education, that is, in a series of efforts, really has him in his entirety for object and produces him as a work. For apart from the purpose which is negatively connected with the family, the actual deed has only a limited content. Finally, just as little should we understand the service as a help in time of need by which in truth the individual in his entirety is rescued, for such help is itself a completely contingent act, the occasion of which is an ordinary reality which can either be or not be. The deed, then, which embraces the entire existence of the blood relation, does not concern the citizen, for he does not belong to the family, nor the individual who is to become a citizen and will cease to count as this particular individual. It has as its object and content this particular individual who belongs to the family, but is taken as a universal being, freed from his sensuous, that is, individual reality. The deed no longer concerns the living but the dead, the individual who, after a long succession of separate disconnected experiences, concentrates himself into a single completed shape and has raised himself out of the unrest of the accidents of life into the calm of simple universality. But because it is only as a citizen that he is actual and substantial, the individual, so far as he is not a citizen but belongs to the family, is only an unreal, impotent shadow. Hegel gets a good ways into paragraph 451 before he finally frames the fundamental question that this entire paragraph is working with and answering in a lot of negative ways before finally telling us what the answer is. And that question is, what does the family's ethical character, its Sittlichkeit, consist in? He asks this only a little bit later after raising one issue. He says, we have to see what constitutes its peculiar ethical character. So what makes the family sittlich in the sense of having to do with the ethical substance, or as we've talked about it in the previous paragraphs, as in some way expressing one fundamental moment of the ethical substance. Why the family? Well, this leads into a number of not quite negations, but certainly saying, well, you're not on the right point. That actually does happen, but that's not what we're focusing on here. This is what we could imagine Hegel to be saying to an interlocutor. And so there's a lot of neither this, nor this, nor this, nor this, nor this going on in this paragraph. And I've summarized them here. So let's just run through these fairly quickly, and then we'll come back to each of these in turn. Family is not just about natural relations. It is not just about power, wealth, or acquisition and maintenance. It's not just training for citizenship or for virtue. It's not just something that's particular or contingent in its action. It's not just about education or raising, like children, for example, or Zihong. And it's not just about providing help in need. Instead, there's something more fundamental, Hegel thinks, that is going on here. Now, that's not to assert that this is actually happening in all families. There are good families and there are bad families. In a certain respect, bad families, from this Hegelian perspective, at least insofar as what we're talking about something here, are not really families in this fundamental respect that we're going to talk about. This is a very interesting point, which we could explore in much greater detail, and which one could certainly think about in terms of family dynamics and paradigms. But let's just go forward from what he's got here, since this is a longish paragraph. So he says, the family is immediately determined as an ethical being, right? So there is this immediate determination as a place where we might say ethics happens. Now, what the hell does that mean? Ethics happens. That means that, concerns about wrong and right and good or bad and valuation and choices get made. A wonderful phrase coming, I think, from Alistair McIntyre, who I think took it from somebody else. I think one of the depth psychologists said that the family is the first school of desire. It's the place where we learn what has value and what doesn't have value. A great example of this, before we go into the actual text, which, by the way, in a certain self-referential way, applies to the text, is valuation of reading. If you want a child to read, so this is something that the social scientists have discovered, and it may be, completely valid or only partly valid. Don't worry about that. Think about it as an illustration of this working here. If you want a child to read, what is the best thing that you can actually do? Is it read to the child? Is it buy them lots of books? No, it's actually for them to see their parents reading. Not just reading to them, like a chore, or as something else, but the parents reading as something that they want to do. Because the child then learns, oh, this is something that adults think is worth doing. It's not just something that they're doing to me because I'm not smart enough to read it myself, or because they want to humor me, or because they feel like they ought to. It's something that is genuinely valuable. This is how desires are shaped. This is how people get their sense of right and wrong and good or bad and better and worse, which is almost more important than just sheer good and bad, right? So the family is a place where we might say ethics happens. Hegel calls this being immediately determined as an ethical being. He says it is within itself an ethical entity only so far as it is not the natural relationship of its members, or so far as their connection is an immediate connection of separate actual individuals. Why? For the ethical principle is intrinsically universal. It goes beyond mere particularity, right? And this natural relationship is just as much a spiritual one, and it is only as a spiritual entity that it is ethical. So when we reduce the relationship within the family to something that is merely natural, we are taking away what Hegel calls its spiritual dimension. And this is not about religion or spirituality in the sort of sense that people, I'm spiritual but not religious, mean. He's talking about something, a higher level of value than the merely natural, one that does not reduce to the needs of the state or the marketplace or whatever else it is that we want. The family provides us, so long as we actually have a functioning one, with a locus where higher values and higher goods have the possibility of being realized, have the possibility of being set out as attractors, have the possibility of being worked on together. So long as it's conceived of as merely natural. Men and women like to get together because they have an innate, desire, just like all the other animals. Look at the dogs, look at the cockroaches. They all got a mate, and we just happen to mate for a long time. Perhaps we do serial monogamy, or perhaps, men are by nature driven to infidelity, or, it's not even infidelity in a natural setting, is it? Because there's no rules, right? And women want to hold on to this is all the stuff the evolutionary biologists and the people who do the second order theorizing from evolutionary biology love to talk about. Hegel would say, that's all nice. That's not what a family is really about. That's not false. Although, the stuff about, monogamy and stuff, that's pretty, a lot of that is on pretty sketchy bases. To generalize as a whole about male and female relationships, it's tough to do. It's worth spending some time with, looking at anthropological studies to do that. Hegel would say that's all besides the point. The family, and even by extension marriage, or kinship, or however you want to think about it, is not a purely natural relationship as opposed to the artificial relationship or the distinctively human relationship of the state. The family is where something else, something important is going on. So a little bit later, he's going to talk in terms of, here we go. He comes back to this not merely a natural relationship. He says, the ethical connection between the members of the family is not that of feeling or the relationship of love. Now you might say, wow, that sounds terrible, Hegel. So we have a family and there's no love within the family. What the hell kind of family are you talking about? I don't want to live in a family like that. Hegel's not saying that there isn't love in the family. He's saying that the feeling of love is not all there is to what's going on. That the ethical character of the family is not just in the fact that we love each other, that we feel affection towards each other. That's nice. That's good. Don't get rid of it. As a matter of fact, it'd be a bad family if it was lacking that. But that's not where the ethical character of the family lies in. Now notice he's talking about the feeling of love here. If you remember back, just a few sections before, when we're talking about the commandment to love thy neighbor, Hegel says it's not just a feeling that's being commanded, it's an action. That is actually what's going to be happening in the ethical character of the family, although he's not going to use the word love there. But there is something going on that we could describe love as comportment or action as opposed to feeling. The feeling can be just natural, right? So he goes on and he says, it seems the ethical principle must be placed in the relation of the individual member of the family to the whole family as the substance, so that the end and content of what he does, and actually is solely the family. Okay, so maybe that's the point, right? So you, as an individual, you're there to make your family proud, or you're there to build up your family, or you have this loyalty, kin first, screw everybody else, or kin first, and then everybody else after them. Hegel says, no, that's not it either. Why not? He says, the conscious end, motivating the action of this whole, insofar as it's directed towards this whole, is itself the individual. Here we're getting at something really interesting. People who are obsessed with the status or good name of their family, they're not really about ethics, Hegel's saying. Because what they're concerned with is the family, but minus its members. If you're concerned about the family, that means that if you take the family as the end, that means that the other individuals in the family. They are the components. They are the constituents of that family. That means that you take them as the end. So if you really value your family, that means that you value all of the members. You don't just value the family as such. There may be points where you actually have to amputate a limb. Somebody is really messing up the family and you say, well, we tried everything we possibly could and then we tried some more and that person is still really screwing things up. We're going to have to ostracize them or kick them out or cut them off. But for the most part, you're not going to be doing that. The notion of something like, for example, honor killings would be totally foreign to what Hegel is talking about here. That would be a pathological understanding of the family from a Hegelian perspective. So he goes on and he says, the acquisition and maintenance of power and wealth. This is another possibility. Maybe what the family is really about is providing resources, acquisition and maintenance of power and wealth. Now, that is an important function of families. As a matter of fact, well-functioning families will indeed, if not acquire more wealth, will at least retain the wealth that they have, will provide for, the necessities of life and then something beyond that so that the people within it can flourish and grow. But that's not the whole point of the family. That's not where its ethical status lies. This is a mistake many people make too, isn't it? Power, wealth, prestige, connections, being a legacy at a particular school, lining yourself up for this or that. Those are things that people do get obsessed about. And they do get obsessed about it in the way that lends a kind of seriousness that belongs to ethics to those pursuits. But that is not the ethical. Why not? Hegel goes on and he says, the acquisition of power and wealth is in part concerned only with needs and belongs to the sphere of appetite. So that's something natural, right? And in other part, they become, in their higher determination, something that is only mediated. What does that mean? He goes on to tell us. This determination does not fall within the family itself, but bears on what's truly universal, the community. It has rather a negative relation to the family and consists in expelling the individual from the family, subduing the natural... Okay, we're going to go on into something else there. This whole business about acquisition of power and wealth, that's how you play out your family vis-a-vis other families or institutions or other individuals within the realm of the community. It's not about the family itself. As a matter of fact, if we wanted to try to extend this, we might say that, what could count as maintaining wealth would not be maintaining something in a bank account, but holding on to a parcel of land that everybody has gotten to know, or holding on to certain family heirlooms and passing them down. And not just passing them down mutely or like museum pieces, but passing them down as something that everybody has title to and everybody hears the stories about. Again, we could go much further into detail on that. This is an extremely rich section here, meditating about the nature of the family and its ethical status. Now, I cut us off a little bit. We're leading into the next discussion. I put not just training for citizenship. Hegel here is going to talk about virtue, right? He goes on and he says, here we go. It's not just expelling the individual from the family, subduing the natural aspect and separateness of his existence, and training him to be virtuous to a life in and for the universal. No, it's not about the family producing good citizens or good soldiers or good consumers or good whatever the hell you want, because that's not treating the individual within the family as individual, as having weight and value as individual. Like Hegel says, the positive end peculiar to the family is the individual as such. Then he goes on and he says, in order that this relationship be ethical, neither he who performs the action nor he to whom the action refers can be in an accidental relationship, as happens perhaps in rendering some assistance or service in a particular case. It must be substantial or whole and universal. This is very important. It is related to the individual as a whole individual, or to the individual qua universal. This is what I was talking about a little bit earlier in terms of a different kind of love. Not the love of feeling, not the love of just natural affection, not the love of desire, right? Not even just the love of, oh, we like to do the same thing, like eat the same foods and watch the same TV shows, or, play ball on the weekend. This is love for who the person fundamentally is. Even in how they're screwed up. Even in how they're not yet developed. I mean, think about this. Parents and children, right? Parents, anybody who's got a kid, your kid is not exactly up to par. If you think that they're perfect in every way, that's because you've deluded yourself and you're totally blind to their many imperfections, and you love them anyway. Right? Because you want what is good for them, and not just good for them as little reflections of yourself, or as how you mediate your relationship to the outside world, or how you make yourself look good with the neighbors or their teachers or this and that, but in relation to them, in relation to who they are. And hopefully, once they get past their natural egoism and selfishness that often extends well into their 20s, they have something like that in relation to you as parents as well, as part of the family. They overlook all the crazy, stupid things that you did, said, forgot to do, your flaws, and they appreciate you as a whole person, not just as something that's instrumental for something else, not just something contingent. Oh, you happen to be my dad, you happen to be my kid, you happen to be my brother, you happen to be my cousin. Since you're here, in a way, Hegel would not be all that amenable to that, phrase from the Fleetwood Mac song that so many people love to quote, especially when they want to commit infidelity, which is, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with, right? Now, in a certain sense, you are thrown together with the people who are your family, but not in the way that like somebody who is just hanging out at a truck stop because their car happened to break down and is hanging out, in the local motel is, right? It's not contingent in that sense. In a certain sense, who I am as a child of parents who my children are as children of me is contingent, but it's not contingent in the same way as this pure contingency, right? That's probably enough about that. Now he says, going on, we cannot understand the action as if it were only imagined that doing him a service would promote his total happiness, whereas the service, being an immediate and actual deed, produces only a particular effect on him, right? We're trying to aim at the whole person. And again, he brings up another thing. Nor must we imagine that service in the form of education in a series of efforts really has the person in his entirety for object and produces him as a work. Raising children is a very important part. Erziehung, bringing people up, is a very important part of a family, right? And thank goodness for all those people who do, in fact, do a decent job in raising their children, because the rest of us are stuck with their kids on the bus, in their classes, all over the place, right? On the internet, in comment streams. But that's not fundamentally what the family is about either, according to Hegel. This is a very radical view that he is taking here. So again, he says, apart from the purpose which is negatively connected with the family, the actual deed has only a limited content. And then he says, finally, just as little should we understand the service as a help in time of need, by which in truth the individual in his entirety is rescued. Such help is a completely contingent act, the occasion of which is an ordinary reality which can either be or not be. So, there are going to be many occasions where you're within a family, somebody saves your bacon. Could be making you a loan, could be paying your bail so you get out of jail, could be picking you up when you've drank too much at a party. Could be all sorts of things, right? Could be cutting you slack when they ought to really punish you. Could be inflicting the punishment that needs to be inflicted at the right point, right? There's all sorts of ways in which we do help each other out in need. That's not fundamentally the ethical import, the ethical aspect of the family either, though, Hegel's saying. So what does it consist in? Well, we've already said partly what it does consist in, an approach to the whole individual, approach to all of the individuals within the matrix of the family, within reason, of course, right? If you've got a million cousins, not quite as practicable. But here Hegel's thinking about a smaller family. And he says, the deed then which embraces the entire existence of the blood relation does not concern the citizen, for he does not belong to the family. It doesn't mean that citizens aren't in families, of course, but qua family member, it's not about being a citizen, nor the individual who is to become a citizen and will cease to count as this particular individual. It has as its object and content this particular individual who belongs to the family. Here's the beautiful part, but is taken as a universal being freed from his sensuous, that is, individual reality. Now here's where Hegel gets a little bit, stranger with it, and we might say, I don't quite follow along with this, but let's see what he has to say. The deed no longer concerns the living, but the dead. The individual who, after a long succession of separate, disconnected experiences, concentrates himself into a single completed shape and has raised himself out of the unrest of the accidents of life into the calm of simple universality. Now, within a family, within a traditional family, we do have the dead as part of the family, and they remain part of the community. I mean, this is the way it was understood, not just in, here he's thinking of traditional Greece and Rome, but also in terms of many other cultures as well. And, if you think about, Christianity and the notion of, some sort of prayer relation with the blessed or the saints, this is part of that as well. I would go so far as to say. Now, of course, with the Protestant Reformation, some of that is being swept away, but in all the early traditional forms of Christianity, that's an integral component to it. So the family is including not just the individuals right here, right now, but also the past members of the family. So he says, now, because it's only as a citizen that he's actual and substantial, the individual, insofar as he's not a citizen but belongs to the family, is only an unreal, impotent shadow. That's from the perspective of the state. There's something that the state literally cannot see clearly in terms of what ought to be going on within the family. And the state, and other ways of looking at things like the state, are probably going to, when they theorize about the family, theorize in terms of these various functions. And they leave out something that's more fundamental, at least from an ethical perspective.